So the skill or ability to rest in consciousness, rest in unbound consciousness is valuable early on in practice before any sort of transformation in identity, but it's also quite valuable after that transformation. And I find that even people who are sort of moving through deeper stages of realization, often only then do they really dial into what that means and have access to it readily in meditation and even outside of meditation. But it's I think, a valuable and important practice, especially when a lot of unconscious material comes, when we feel disoriented in practice, in sustained meditation situations like retreat, or just when we feel emotionally triggered and are not able to find the specific method of inquiry that addresses whatever it is that's sort of disrupting our feeling of equanimity. It's a more passive approach, but an effective approach to calming the mind, calming the push and pull on experience, calming the struggle. So I wanted to go a little bit into this, and it's the kind of thing that I've said many times in many different ways, and I will continue to, because it's really just it's a feel. It's like dance or something where there's no exact set of words or steps that are going to teach this to you every single time or every single person. It's much more of a feel thing. It's an intuitive interaction with the presence of consciousness, and you almost, in one sense, form a relationship, although it's not a dualistic relationship. It's a intuitive knowing of when it's appropriate or relevant to just rest in this sort of spaciousness, this unbinding of thought, belief, and identity that is ongoing. So I do a lot of guided meditations on this, but I can also talk about it a little more, perhaps academically or directly here. But I just want to initially make the point that it's really valuable for, I think, people at all levels of realization. And with deep realization, it's sort of almost automatic, where you sit to meditate and then it's just there. It's just this deep and profound quality of presence, endlessly unbinding, is immediately available. But learning to know when to just attune attention there versus somewhere else, and learning to recognize when there's a tendency going on to reject experience, even the subtlest levels of experience, to notice when that's happening and just almost automatically let yourself sort of just be overtaken by this unbinding of unbound consciousness. Is a valuable skill, even in deep stage realization. It's a valuable intuition. So when you feel disoriented, when you feel like there's a tendency to try to find some resting place or find some point of view, and yet simultaneously knowing that that's just not going to happen because it can't happen anymore, because there's no identity structure left to do that. That discord right there could be said to be itself a tendency to subtly identify within consciousness, or to subtly try to back into a space of me, or a space of subjectification, and to notice when that's happening, and then just allow yourself to completely dilate out in and as the entirety of consciousness is valuable and works well, actually. So this talk, this lecture is really for anyone at any level. I'm going to try to make it as simple and direct as I can, such that it's available to anyone, regardless of your insight or stage of realization or understanding of any of this. It's a simple and direct exploration of your own internal process. So I suppose it's a bit of a fusion between a guided meditation and a talk, at least the first part of this talk. One way of accessing this is to just start by noticing the senses. We can just put our attention into the sense of sound, the sound field. And when we do this, we want to just be wide open. We're not trying to grab onto one sound and identify it. We're literally just putting our attention fully into the field of sound, like pouring a cup of water into another container where it's just going to fill that container. That's our attention in sound. So we just take it all in. There's sound. Just that sound. Just the hearing. Just the heard. We're just reminding ourselves of what it is to put attention there. Similarly, we can put our attention in the body sense. If you need to do a quick scan from head to toe, from the top of your head, through your face, chest, belly, legs, feet, hands, arms, just feel it all. Just a dilated attention in the whole body sense. And it may also not have any boundary of an apparent body wall. It may just be a field of sensation. That's perfectly okay. That's what we want to just acknowledge, that space of sensation, wherever it is, however it is. The visual field is the same thing in that we can just move our attention into the forms and shapes and colors and lines and shades, the lights and darks. Now, there may be a more a stronger tendency to extrapolate a three-dimensional world over that visual field for many people, and that's okay. Just see if you can just notice a subtlety somewhere in that entire field that is not really defined by a line or a shape or a form or a color or a label, just some kind of raw seeing, as if you were a 6-month-old who didn't have labels for anything and didn't have a sense of separation. Didn't have a sense of self separate from its environment. And it just opened its eyes and looked and saw all of that visual stimulus. We can just dilate out in that. Just take it all in. That's the visual field, the visual sense, or just seeing, just the scene. We can do this with taste quite easily as well. We're not eating right now, or most of us aren't. But if you take the opportunity next time you eat during lunch or whatever, to just close your eyes and just let your attention completely merge with the sensation of flavor, the experience of flavor. Not imagining what food you're eating or your mouth, or not labeling the flavor notes, but just totally immersed in taste. That's the taste sense. Also works with smell, of course. So those are the 5 senses. Now, for some of us, there'll be a sense of being, a sense of me or I at the center of our experience. And that may or may not be there, but there also is the potential to experience, or at least perceive, something we would call a thought. So regardless of how you enter this space of consciousness, there can be a noticing of thought, a thought structure that says, I am ... or this experience is, or even a non-conceptual thought, like a visual overlay, a sense of being in space, a sense of someone moving through time. This also may just be experienced as a pure sense of being that's sort of undifferentiated. But I often lead people here with thought, because that's pretty prominent in most people's experience, is a thought stream, or the most recent perception you had about whatever, yourself, another person, a situation. So you just attune to where that seems to be without analyzing, without creating more thoughts about it. Just notice. You might notice you didn't have to go anywhere for that to happen either. It's sort of already where you are, that thought, whatever it is, the analysis thought, the doubt thought, the narrative thought that says, this is how practice goes for me. This is how it went in the past. This is how it will go in the future. What I want, what I don't want, problems and solutions, imagining the past and future visually or through narrative. All of that substance, if there is one, that seems to make it possible to be aware of that thought, those thoughts, those perceptions. It's right there, right here. You don't have to go out to it. You're already in contact with it. So when you notice that, how far do you have to move to know the being, the purity of being, the purity of the one that seems to know or not know, but seems to be somehow in contact with or aware of thought? Now you're directly in contact with, knowingly in contact with consciousness. It's the whole space. Consciousness is that thought in the way I'm speaking. It's also the ability to be aware of the thought. It's also the entirety of the space that feels like you in this contemplation. And in the same way we do in the senses, we can sort of dilate our attention out in this space to include all thoughts, any thought that could arise, the next thought that arises or doesn't, the sense of the thinker, the sense of being. There's no boundaries here. We first learn about boundlessness in consciousness, whether we realize it or not. The key is not to grasp thoughts or beliefs, but to just notice. And most importantly, to notice you don't go anywhere to experience a thought. It's not out there somewhere. It's continuous with the knowing of the thought. The thought and the knowing of the thought are continuous. And taste this continuity and notice you're tasting it from the continuity itself, not from somewhere else. Because somewhere else is another thought. And we can also touch that thought from zero distance. This is how it is. It's a sort of dynamic feeling process, and yet it's completely self-enclosed and all-inclusive of all experience. Everything we've ever known is here, or everything we ever thought we knew. Every doubt we've ever had in one form or another, and every belief we've ever had in one form or another is here. And when we notice that we don't have to introduce will here, don't have to push or pull or struggle on any experience or thought, a certain equanimity in consciousness arises. It's almost like an endless merging into itself. All aspects are immediately accommodated. All movements are immediately accommodated as here-ness, just this. Pure being. So nothing apart, nothing separate. This is unbound consciousness. Anything can arise here, including a doubt about it. So it could say, thought could say, I don't know if this is unbound consciousness. Well, do you notice how that's right here already? You didn't have to go to that. Doesn't have an edge. Didn't start somewhere, didn't end anywhere. There's some sort of perception going on that seemed to be a thought, and that's okay. There's also some sort of perceiver, apparently, and that's okay. It may feel like an I or not, but it's just what seems to be happening, not in any particular place or space. I hesitate to give a visual image of this or anything, but it has the feel of being in all directions, including behind and front, above, below, center, everywhere. Now, one way I think that helps, that sort of description I just gave, which could become a mental image and could become another thought that we're identifying with. But the reason I say that is often the sense And it's a non-conceptual thought. It is a thought, but the sense of being a center, being the thinker, being the, well, even the you, the liver of your life, often seems like it's sort of behind the eyes or behind one eye or behind the forehead. Or for some people, it feels like it's almost in the back of the head or behind the head, like some kind of vantage point. It's a very subtle thought, but it is also a thought. And somehow when we sort of recognize that consciousness can dilate out even beyond that, behind you, behind what feels like you, sometimes it sort of helps to realize that that's just another thought. Behind is another thought. Behind a view is another thought. The eyes, the head, the back of the head, behind the head. You don't see these. You can't find those. So they're thoughts. And the thought is just this spaciousness of knowing thought. The thought is the spaciousness of knowing thought. There's no one doing that. It's just pure knowingness. Again, unbound consciousness, knowingness. Now, when this is sort of clarifying, and hopefully it is for many people here to various degrees, you obviously don't label it. You don't call it unbound consciousness. I'm just using the term. You don't call it knowingness or consciousness rigpa or being or I am. You don't need the terms. That's the point. Any term forming is just the next thought, which is okay. We're not rejecting that. We just don't voluntarily create it. We don't voluntarily start a thought. We don't voluntarily divide up our experience of consciousness. There's no need to do that. So it's a relinquishment of will. We're relinquishing will to its source, not the source or some special intelligent source, just its own source right now. And then it gets very still, very unbound. And then the unbinding is natural and automatic, unbinding from anything, any perception, any thought, any movement, any stillness. We're not binding to anything, any perception, or any view or frame of reference. And when that unbinding is ongoing, when there's no binding going on, there's also no one doing it. There's no sense of the perception of the one being bound or doing the binding. When the will subsides, the illusion of the one with the separate one that has its own individual separate will apart from everything subsides. So I'm inclined to just stop talking because hopefully once you've led yourself here, or I've led you here, or you've reminded yourself of this natural unbinding that's always available, it feels so good in one sense, neutral. It feels so much like there's nothing to do because we spend our days struggling with ourselves, trying to do, or even trying to not do. So it's a huge relief when those are seen to be nothing but thoughts. And this knowingness, this consciousness is just the case. It's not caused. If anything, you've been looking past it, trying to look for it. Doesn't require meditation even. How can you meditate yourself into what's already the case? It's that simple, that immediate and neutral. So again, I encourage anyone to utilize this, reminding of yourself this, and it is a sort of meditative practice as well, especially at first. When you feel bound up by the mind, when you feel pushed on by the mind, by life, by emotions, you're the one that started the pushing and pulling at some point and didn't realize it, but the pushing and pulling starts to feel like it's happening to you at some point, and that's very uncomfortable. When that discomfort's there, it's like, great, okay, I know exactly what to do now. Sit, stop, put away your distractions. Lead yourself right to this, as I just did, or in any other way that works for you. You'll find your own way as well. Some people use an attunement, a statement, attunement, a short practice. It's fine. There's no exact right way, of course. So that's the attunement to or practice of unbound consciousness. So a little about why this is the way it is, or why this is helpful and why it works. And a bit of contrast to sort of some of the ways we work in deeper stages of realization when we're working directly with the sense fields, especially with non-duality. I would say even when you're doing that, even when you're trying to see through the illusion of a subject-object split or form, when you're starting to realize in the herd there's only the herd, or in the scene there's only the scene, etc. This is working directly in the sense fields, and attention is moving directly into the sense fields. I still feel that this is a very valuable practice even at those stages. You just do it at a different time, perhaps, when you're sitting and meditating. And here's the reason why, at least in my experience. Because the initial misperception, the initial delusion of separation, or illusion of separation, is not structured in the senses. It's not of the sense fields. It's not a fault of the senses. If it's a fault of anything, it's a fault of the way we interact with thought and the way the sense of the self, the thinker, the agent arises in consciousness. Now, even consciousness is completely innocent here. It's really just an illusion. It's a sort of reflective thing that happens, where the moment we feel like a thinker, we feel like an I, then we feel like a thinker, then we feel like the one in the world, then it feels like there's an external, three-dimensional, separate world out there. And that's always underpinned by discomfort, dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness. Why? Well, it's not true. That's why. It's just not that way. There is not actually that type of separation. But when that type of separation is the entire foundation for our identity, then unfortunately, everything we do with our identity feels uncomfortable. It sounds terrible, but it's kind of true. And that's why this is it's sort of a deconstruction. It's not as much a deconstruction. It's more of a seeing into the deep levels of identity, what's what. And then the unbinding happens automatically. You can even say awakenings and these dropping away of perceptual filters are really just side effects of the looking, of the seeing, of the willingness. This goes back to that wonderful term by Dogen, practice enlightenment. It's the same thing. They're a continuum, practice enlightenment. They can't be separated, nor do they need to be separated. So the willingness to see is itself enlightenment. There just may be a temporal phase shift there where it's not immediately obvious. But again, as the seeing deepens, as the willingness to see, feel, hear, taste deepens, and our ability to actually remain in those sense fields longer improves, let's say, or it just becomes easier to do. There's no reason we wouldn't just completely immerse ourselves in that and would just let go into it. That'd be so easy, right? Well, why isn't it easy? Well, not because of the sense fields, not because of the truth of non-duality. The truth of non-duality just is. There's not dualistic constructs anywhere in the universe or in the apparent universe. The reason is the pull back into the mind, back into identity. Oh, wait a minute, but I have to take care of this first. Or what happens to that? No. How will I manage my life? Those subtle doubts or not so subtle doubts, that's what keeps the tendency to either re-identify or try to, depending on our sort of depth of understanding or insight, or try to recreate an internal world, even when that's obvious that can't happen anymore. That tendency itself is really just a pull from the mind. It's a pull from conditioning. It's a pull from a pull of really just unseen areas in consciousness. And that will have, it often does have a strong emotion tone to it. That's it. That's what's pulling us back, so to speak, or trying to re-identify. It's not anything about sound. The sound field is profoundly enjoyable, just as it is, completely immersed. There's no one to enjoy it. The sound, the hearing is the enjoyment of the hearing, one and the same. So when you taste that, you know it, and it's obvious. But why don't you just stay there? Well, again, it's the pull of the dualistic constructs of mind, belief structures, doubts. And again, it has a very personal quality in the human dimension, and that is things like shame, doubt, resentment, blame, and so forth. So these are, you could almost say, like gravitational pulls. It's a pull. There's a pull in consciousness somewhere. It's like a magnetic pull, right? It's pulling attention up into that space, which is fine. It's completely okay that it's doing that. That's why you apply the practice I've been talking about, for the first half of the talk. Your attention wants to get pulled up into consciousness, into thought and belief. It's a mistake to say, oh, well, I know I'm not an I. There's no I here. There's no thinking, no thought is real. Thoughts are all not real. There's no one to feel the emotion. So, okay, well, fat lot of good that does you if you keep getting your attention pulled up into that contracted space or into that disorienting place, right? So yeah, there are other inquiries that can be helpful here, of course, and direct work in the emotion field and all of it. But as a very simple and basic practice that is a passive unbinding of all vasanas, all fixations, all polarity in consciousness, this unbinding, this natural, intentional relinquishment of will into the space of consciousness is a very valuable practice. So I would recommend it. I don't know what people's schedules look like, but half hour a day as a basic practice. It's not quite the same, and just to make a contrast, it's not quite the same as what I would call natural meditation. Because natural meditation has no point at all. And that's also valuable. So again, depending on how much time you have, a half an hour of each if you can do it. And then another half hour sometime during the day of, direct investigation of or inquiry into whatever perceptual filter you're working through in deeper stages of realization, say the experience of a subject and an object, experience of form and perception, the remaining sense of some I or I am sense floating around somewhere. You can also work at sort of probing into those as well and doing various inquiries as a different part of your practice. But as a basis to just have the easy access to and trust in this unbound consciousness can be quite valuable. I think probably mantra meditation is pretty good at this, I would say. Things like that. It tends to work that way. Everyone's experience is going to be different, though, so it's hard to really delineate it that way and say this is the kind of technique you should use. It's more of a feel and a intuitive acknowledgement of what is being pointed to. And I have a whole playlist on consciousness, and most of those videos I'm pointing to this in one way or another. So yeah, I wanted to talk about that. I also find that in a retreat setting, when someone gets sort of destabilized or comes to me and they just feel, I don't know, dysregulated, confused, lost, kind of freaking out a little bit, it happens on occasion, and every retreat to some degree it'll happen. Usually what I do is point them to this. Actually, this is probably mostly what I do is when in that case is to point them to this sort of equanimity of consciousness. There's a term by Cicada called the mellow maturity of consciousness. I think that does dawn after years of this kind of practice. But yeah, usually it's something like that. It's an unknowing introduction of will into consciousness somewhere. And it may be about a certain thought or a certain doubt. And often it is a certain thought. Like, interestingly, sometimes it's, I can't keep track of my thoughts, right? The mind just gets a lot quieter and there's a lot of unbinding and there's a knowing of the thoughts, but you're not identified in the stream of thoughts suddenly. So you just sort of find yourself in this bizarre space where you're trying to reorient to thoughts, but you see that can't be, that doesn't make sense anymore. So it's like thoughts are just sort of floating around, but there's one thought you're seeing from, there's one view you're looking from, and that is, oh my God, if I can't orient to thoughts, I can't orient at all, right? That's scary somehow. And the moment you actually recognize that's a thought, you can lead yourself right back to that unbound consciousness, interestingly enough. This isn't every time someone has that sort of destabilized experience in a retreat, but it's not uncommon, I would say. So yeah, this practice is even valuable in that setting, in a retreat setting. And an adjunct to it, I will say, is you may, I'm sure people watching this have a huge variation in experience with this. Some people may not quite get it yet or whatever. I'm sure others get it instinctually and just can go there very easily. And others can lead themselves back there and have the intuition on when and how to do that easily. So there's a big spectrum of this, but like anything, the more you sort of practice, the better you'll get at it. But I will make one adjunct to it, a sort of adjunct technique or practice. And that is, when you're doing this, if you don't feel particularly emotionally triggered or anything like that, it's often much easier. If there's emotional material kind of coming to the surface or some tension, things like that, a lot of contraction, it can be more challenging to sort of stabilize into this unbound. In that case, it can be helpful just to inquire. And in fact, you can do this anytime, but it can be helpful to inquire, what is it that's really bothering me? What is it, like, just in general, in the practice, in my life, the wider perspective? What is it that's really like grabbing at me right now, troubling me, in a simple statement, in a simple thought? Often that will help. And you'll be like, oh yeah, okay, I'm afraid of this thing happening, after retreat. It could be a financial thing, a logistical thing, a emotional situation with another person. It can be anything. Sometimes just recognizing that's the thought that's sort of in the background that you're kind of looking from, and you're looking from that view, the view of, I need to do something. And from that view, you're trying to do nothing. You're trying to go into this unbound conscious space of just relaxation, but without acknowledging first that thought, that concern, that practical issue in your life, without at least acknowledging it, it's hard to see past that view because the view is being formed by it. So it can be helpful just to inquire, what is it that's really making me feel stuck here, or something that's really bothering me, or what am I afraid of? Right. And try to look for something specific and practical that's going on in your life. And sometimes just giving that some time and space and sitting with it, even writing it down, even making a plan, maybe, okay, all right, well, let me just convince myself that after retreat, I'm going to take these 3 steps and it'll probably take care of the situation. That's the best I can come up with at this moment. Just it'll maybe help that settle. Like, okay. And then all of a sudden things will just calm down a little bit. So at the very least, though, again, if something feels really sticky, a lot of contraction and going on with you in the retreat, or when you're trying to practice this unbound sort of neutral consciousness, see if there's something hiding in the background that's a reasonably identifiable belief, and that can be really helpful as well. There may be more than one, but often, surprisingly, it can just be one. It might seem like there's a whole lot hanging out back there, like a whole lot of stuff waiting in the, gallows to come charging in when you open yourself to the emotion body. But often it's one thing. It's like one sentinel belief or sentinel emotional charge that's really keeping things feeling stuck, right? And just give yourself permission to just fully experience whatever that thought is, that belief, whatever, even if it's silly or doesn't make sense, whatever, but just be open to it. And then often just bringing that into consciousness will help settle the whole thing. Doesn't have to, but it can sometimes. Just looking at some of the comments here. Yeah, someone said like, who is asking the questions, who is having the experience? That can also lead you back to unbound consciousness, and the person who wrote it that may be their way of doing it, and that's great. The key is not to keep asking that question. Sometimes people will do that, like in comments, like I'll make a whole video and then the comments like, well, who could do that anyway, or something. That may be a little bit of dissociation or an avoidance pattern. But yeah, if in the moment, to lead yourself back to what I'm talking about with unbound consciousness, for some people, it actually helps to ask who's experiencing the thought. I will say that does not work for everyone, for sure. It wouldn't have worked for me, I don't think, because I didn't have that question wasn't interesting to me or wasn't salient. For some people it is, though, for sure. Some people it's where am I? Where is the sense of I located? And it just leads them right into that sort of consciousness samadhi. So again, everyone will have their own way of doing this. But again, the key is it's a sort of self-validating, self-obvious knowing when it's there. Like, again, terms like knowingness are nice because they sort of point to it.
Sorry, Angelo.
What's that?
Somehow, maybe it's echoing. I should just be quiet. I don't know. It seems like people think I messaged them, but I don't even know what happened.
Oh,
So
okay.
just ignore me, everyone. It's goofy.
Okay. TM. Yeah. Okay. So that's just one aspect of things. That's not everything, of course. But it can come into play frequently at various levels of realization, at various stages that I've noticed. And so I like to point it out. It's one of those things sometimes I find it really is what someone needs. Like, again, in deeper stages of realization, there can be so little identity left. It can be incredibly hard to know, I want to say what to orient to, but you get to the point where you know that even trying to orient is not really helpful. And yet, in the relative sense, certain techniques, approaches, and practices can still be helpful. And that's kind of how this works sometimes. So I've seen people even with deep insight, very clear, and yet there's a heavy stickiness going on, and they don't know what it is. They can't get to it. They can't get underneath it. Sometimes just pointing out, like, you're looking for a view, you're looking for a frame of reference, and you're not gonna find one. And it's like, oh, that's right. Yeah. And that can be helpful just in and of itself. But other times it's really a sort of practice thing. The habit of the mind is strong, and the thoughts can start coming so quickly that they can kind of cause some disorientation, even if there's no sense of one who could orient, if that makes sense. Yeah. Someone said, I'm confused about self-inquiry, unbound consciousness, and natural meditation. They all seem the same to me. That's great. And so that's perfect. They're all the same. So you're in this experience of sameness. Now, then a thought says, I'm confused. Where's that? Just experience it directly. It's just a wave in the ocean. Yeah. Just let it all collapse into one pure experience, and don't worry about making distinctions. So I based on some of the questions, I'll just add one thing to this, and that is, when you're practicing this in the moment, right? Really, when you're practicing any form of meditation, you could sort of do this, I suppose. But when you're really practicing this, one form of thought that gets overlooked frequently is the thought that says, and they're all forms of doubt, but it sort of says, I don't know if it's this or it's that, right? Like a distinction question, a binary question. Wait a minute, is this unbound consciousness I'm experiencing, or is it whatever? Okay. You have to recognize that's a thought in the practice. If you don't, then yeah, you're on the thought train again. Right. So anytime the ego is holding a gun to your head, it's like, okay, you need to make a decision right now. Is it this or is it that? What's underneath it? It's a doubt. It's a doubt. It's a form of doubt. Yeah. Because consciousness isn't this or that. It doesn't make distinctions. Yeah. All the practices are only pragmatic means. They're rafts, right? The raft to get you across the river. Once you're across the river, just throw the raft away. Let it go. The techniques and so forth. Yeah. So one thought that says, okay, is it this or is it that? Or I'm confused, or I don't know XYZ. That's just a thought. Immediately a thought. Then you just start from the beginning and practice in the way I described. Do you notice that thought is right here? Did you go somewhere to find that thought? What is the quality of it? What is the nature of it? Where is it? Where are you, the thinker? And notice it's all the same substance. There's nothing that needs to figure anything out. There's no problem with the thought at all, because it doesn't compel you to do anything, because there's no one apart from the thought to be compelled. It doesn't reference something in the apparent outside world that's objectively true or false, because the outside world that's objectively true or false is also another thought form for you right now. So it's all continuous, like a continuity, continuum. Some people use the term unity consciousness. It's fine, but you're not going to need a term here. Yeah, someone said, is it something like you won't need to touch it when you're there? Or I'm sorry, you won't need to ask if it's right or wrong when you touch it. Yeah, that's right. If there's something going, is it this or is it that? I don't want to say that's not it. I just want to say there's still identification with thought. You're not seeing that thought feels like a thought to some thinker. The thinker, you, the being, the one who's curious, is that separate from the movement of thought, the movement of mind, the doubt, the curiosity, or is it all one substance, one pure knowing? And when you see it's one pure knowing, you stop. Stop. Don't make thoughts. Don't make conclusions. Don't second guess. Just stop. It's quite nice. Because for once, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to be anything. Being can't be anything. It just is. The moment you convince yourself that being becomes something, or you become something, that's mind identification, right? How about just I? How about just being? How about just conscious? Don't conjugate it. People are wondering things, wondering. This is like conceptual, right? Is this like neti? Is this like pattern interrupt? So I'm hoping you're doing this right now, not trying to understand it. Yeah. Pattern interrupt is a thought. Neti is a thought. I is a thought. Being is a thought. Non-being is a thought. TM is a thought. Let those thoughts just melt into the wholeness of unbound thoughts stuff. Sometimes I say it like, what is the thought made out of? What is the substance of thought? Not what the symbol of the thought is seemingly pointing to. Right? That's identification with thought. You're identified with thought if you think it means something. If you think it's pointing to something real out there, or in the la la land of philosophy, or some objective truth. If that's how it feels to be thinking, then there's mind identification. If there's just a complete merging with the substance of what feels like thinking, thinkingness, knowingness, beingness, then it will stop. And you'll see it was already stopped. How can unity move? How can unity go anywhere or become anything? It's already everything. Yeah. How can the pure light that's shining on the screen of the movie become pure light? No character that's an illusion created by the light dancing on the screen. No character in that apparent movie is going to recognize the light. The light is the light. It has to recognize that itself. And even recognizing is saying too much. It's not something that happens. Let go of the idea of recognizing. Let go of the idea of awakening. Let go of the idea of one moment in the future. Let go of the idea of I'm afraid. If there's afraidness, feel it, but let go of the idea of it. Remain just here. Just this.
Angelo, you
Yeah.
might want to answer Sabrina's comment.
Okay. Let me scroll to find it. I'm not really doing a Q&A. I'm just sort of playing off some comments popping up in here. The sense of you.
No, I know. I just thought it would be
okay.
valuable.
The sense of you, Angelo, is fading. Good. Also understanding of the words you're saying. Good. Yeah. This is scary. Yeah. How can I allow non-understanding and be able to operate in the world? That's a thought. You have to see in this moment, that's one thought. The fear barrier. So you're experiencing what I call the fear barrier, which is fine. Many people here have gone through that. And it's intense. Often when it comes, like it's a very strong physiologic reaction. But it's a physiologic reaction. It's the body's reaction. Right? Now, a thought is going to, so this is when the gloves come off. And the mind that just makes these meandering, simple thoughts here and there suddenly becomes a demon. It says, again, it puts the gun to your head. It's like, okay, if you keep going, you're going to go crazy. That's one. That's a big trigger for some people. You're going to lose your mind. You will be insane, right? That's number one. Number two, it'll say you're going to abandon your children or your family. Number three, it'll say you won't be able to function or work, provide, and take care of yourself. Those are thoughts right now, right? Right now, you don't have to work. Right now, you don't have to do anything. You're here to meditate, right? You're here to sit and inquire. So I can't tell you, I can't make you a promise of what will happen after awakening or after you really let go or go through the fear barrier. Why? Because I can't make you a promise of what will happen if you don't do that. I don't know what anyone will do, regardless of awakening or not awakening. Some people, kind of fall down in life, and that does happen. But generally speaking, with awakening, I don't see that. It does change the way you perceive everything, but people do fine. And they do take care of their children, and they do function and feed themselves. You don't need to figure out how to do that right now. Isn't that great? That's the mind. That's the mind trying to get you back, trying to grab you and go, hey, wait a minute. I've been here your whole life. I'm your friend. I'm your best friend. Don't abandon me. Because if you do, what? You won't be able to function. So again, you may be ready right now to let go or not, and it doesn't matter. But at some point, you'll come up against this fear barrier, and it'll be like, oh, these are just thoughts. Right? The body's just responding to unbinding of identity. It's just a response. It's fine. Again, it can be intense, but you can also even recognize even the word intense is a thought. Even the thoughts, I can't handle this. The thought. Find out if you can handle it. Just go through it, Yeah. You're in a good place. Cool. That was a good suggestion. Yeah. Yeah, for me, I'm sure many people here have heard me say this in one form or another, but I remember before awakening happened with me, I know it was within a few months, but I can't remember. It's been years now. But with a few months before it, I had this point where I was sitting, meditating. I remember exactly where I was sitting. I was sitting on a bed. I was meditating. It was the middle of the day. And something just really dropped. Like the mind just got very quiet. There's like this major like unbinding from thoughts. Got very quiet. And I started to feel that fear. It was like, physical experience, like, whoa. And I don't know if there were a lot of thoughts about it, but there was just a feeling of like, oh, what if I let go? It's going to be like, who the heck knows what's going to happen, right? It's kind of an unknown fear, I think. And I remember like just immediately stopping meditating. I just got up and was like, okay, well, that's scary. But I didn't think much about it, really. I don't think I contemplated it much. But strangely, I don't know, a few weeks or a couple months after that or something, I remember very randomly, not during meditation, having the thought come to me. It was like one of those really clear thoughts, which don't happen to me very often. I haven't in my life, but it was almost like a voice. And it was like, okay, if that happens again, when that happens again, I'm going to go right through it. I'm going to let go. So I don't know if that has to happen for a lot of people. Some people it does, some people it doesn't, where you have that first taste of it, something's afraid, and then you just need to digest it. It's like a seed is planted, and then later on, something in your physiology or your mind or your being or whatever just goes, oh, okay, it's okay. That's where I'm going to go. I'm going to let go next time. And that's what happened for me. And then when it came the next time, it was just a very subtle impulse of like, whoa, this is like a free fall, like, but then I let go and there was no fear. So I didn't get it the second time, but the first time it was really intense. And that can happen. The kind of worst thing I see with that is you don't know what it is. And then you get so scared and you tell yourself this story about it that you just completely distract yourself and kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, and you like avoid practices or meditation or inquiry for a while. Usually I think even in that situation, people come back, but it can be daunting when there's still a significant amount of mind identification. So you believe the thoughts, the fearful thoughts, and the fear feels very real because it's a physiologic experience. If anyone's not clear on why that happens, it's actually a pretty simple explanation. And that is to the degree that we're identified with thought and consciousness, meaning not just the narrative thoughts, but we're identified with the way our thoughts make the world look, right? Three-dimensional, time-bound, physical, fully physical, right? To the degree that we're identified with that way of experiencing and seeing and thinking, our body or our body mind doesn't know any better than to interpret a subsiding of that or a cessation of that mind identifying process that keeps just going on all day. When that ceases, even for a short time, the body only can interpret it as death or a physical threat. It's just not a physical threat, but it can be easily interpreted that way, and often is, because how does the body mind know any different, right? So often it feels like that. And so for me, it did. I remember thinking like, I don't think I was convinced I was going to die letting go or during meditation or anything, but there was definitely the determination that like I've suffered so much that if that's what has to happen, that's what has to happen. But something in me knew exactly where to go to. I at the same time, I knew exactly where I needed to go, which was to let go, really. And that had to happen, and it was going to happen, and I was going to relinquish to it. At the same time of that, there was this kind of background thought. I was like, well, if I'm going to die doing this, then so be it, because the rest of the way I've been doing things hasn't worked very well. So that's kind of how the fear barrier was for me, the initial fear barrier. Okay, someone says, I don't understand surrender or letting go. Who is surrendering? Well, I would say who's asking who, right? You don't need to know the answer to who is surrendering for surrender to happen. Just like you don't need to know the answer to who is inquiring for inquiry to happen. Because when you see there's no who, then everything's already happening by itself, and it's happening automatically. So there's nothing special about spirituality versus baking a cake, right? You don't ask who's baking the cake, you just bake the cake. Similar to self-inquiry and similar to who's asking a question. Yeah. So that can be a way to actually bind yourself back into thoughts of like who, but I don't know who. It's like the belief behind that is I have to know who to do this practice. That's the belief, and that's a thought. That's a common one. It's a good question. Okay. I think we're about done. So if someone wants to ding us out, I will stop recording and then close the meeting and reopen it so I can render the video. And I'll see everybody for Q&A.
Okay.
Did you ask a question? Sorry, I just heard the end of the something.
Oh, sorry, the original sound thing goes on and off, and when it's off, you can't hear the ding. Here you go.
Thank you, everyone.